Hello everybody, welcome back to a new video. Today I want to go over my bass patch for Psytrance and kind of go over some of the things that are interesting about it. I want to drive home the fact that it's actually a very simple patch and that you should be able to make it yourself very easily. And therefore I'm actually not going to give away the presets or the Ableton chain, instrument chain that I use. But instead I encourage you to make it yourself and experiment a bit with it yourself. I am gonna give a few pointers that you should keep in mind while making your own sounds. So yeah, let's go into the project and see what's going on. Alright, so here's the project. As you can see, we have my main chain here, which is this one. You can see we have my Serum here, in which I make the actual sound. And then I have a utility to make it mono, and we have some effects here that I'm gonna go over later and kind of show what each and every one of them does. Finally, I have a stereo spread which is turned off for the moment, but I want to talk about that a little bit later. For now, I'm quickly going to play you the bass sound itself, and as you can hear, it's a nice gritty version of a Psytrance bass. And so this is the chain which I open up whenever I open up a project. This is what it looks like, and I tend to experiment with it a lot while actually producing the track. Maybe I want a different tone or something, and I'll experiment with that. But I have this chain saved somewhere in a folder which I can quickly open up and start working with, so I don't have to make it from scratch every time. That's just better for my workflow. So let's open up the patch here. As you can see, it's a Serum Patch and there's nothing much going on. As you can see, the effects are all turned off. I tend to not do the effects inside Serum themselves. I used to do a lot of effects in here, but I found out that the effects are just not, don't have the type of sound that I want them to have. They're more useful on more complex sounds, and sounds where it's less about like phase alignment and stuff like that than the actual sound. Because one thing you need to keep in mind with making a Psytrance bass is that the phase of your bass sound is very important, and it kind of makes or breaks your sound how you use phase inside the Serum bass sound, and how you can use that to your advantage. And I think that these kind of, especially the multiband compressor, just does too much destructive phase cancellation or phase distortion, and we don't want that. Therefore, I don't tend to use them. So I kind of want to go over the patch itself. As you can see, I use the LFOs for my envelopes. I've set this to envelope A and B, and I've set it to B, so maybe if I want to experiment with different waveforms, which I'm going to show you in a bit, I don't have to set it up manually. And the second LFO is also in envelope mode. Keep in mind that the timing is 1/16 for all three of these LFOs that I use. And this is set to the filter cutoff, so I have a separate one for the filter cutoff that I can just edit. And then finally we have the third one, which is controlling the noise, where I can load in a click. And as you can see, I've loaded up click number 2 here from this attacks kick pack here. And this is the one I standardly use, and it opens up with this, and it's fairly nice sound. Adds a subtle bit of extra to the click. And one thing for your click to keep in mind is that you can tune it with the noise pitch. Each percentage is a semitone, so keep that in mind, and it can really change the texture of your initial attack, so your click sound, and that's a really cool trick you can use. So for the main patch itself, what I actually use this for. So as you can see, what we're doing here basically is just having a saw wave and playing that through a filter, which is making this plucky movement. I'm using LFOs here because then you can set the exact timing instead of having to fiddle around with numbers and calculate decay timings and release timings. I can just move these around and they'll always be within the time frame of one note. So they will never overlap. So even if I change the BPM, I don't have to go back and change any of the timings. It will always be the the timing will always be correct. So that's one thing to keep in mind here is using LFOs, you can get really deep with the timing. You can also get really deep with the shape. For example, you have much more control over the individual points. As you can see here for the volume, we actually use a slight volume dip and then go back up, kind of add a little bit more of a sub bass womp when the filter is down a little bit more. And that's a cool trick. So LFOs just kind of give you more control over the volume and the sound of your bass sound. And the main LFO I tend to use is LFO2. This is where you control the tone and the how much mid-range and that kind of stuff, and the clickiness of your bass sound. As you can hear, you're able to kind of add more clickiness this way, and you can really dial in a nice click if you want to, or you can open it up slightly more and get a nicer gritty tone out of it. Something like this. And in this case I'm using a saw wave. Something really cool I tend to do with a saw wave is if I want to change the amount of sub bass I have, I don't use a different sub, I don't use EQing for that, I just go into the wave and I directly edit the waveform. So if you click up here, you can edit individual harmonics, and that way you can, for example, add a bit more sub. As you can see now, we have a saw wave with more sub than normal, and I tend to turn it down a little bit and kind of get a little bit of an upgoing slope here. As you can see, that means that the sub is a little less than it would normally be. So that's a really cool trick you can use to kind of dial in different frequencies. You can also use it for other frequencies. I'll go over that in a little bit. But first I want to kind of go over the extra effects that we're going through and kind of the philosophy there. And then we'll come back into Serum and see some more advanced things you can do, for example, with other waveforms and stuff like that. But first I want to go through the effects. As I said, this effect here, the utility is just to make things mono. Sometimes I want to use it to kind of gain stage at this point. I might be able to place this anywhere in the chain if I have one effect of this where I dial in a certain setting that is just too loud or too quiet. I can use this, for example, place it here after the dynamics maybe, and if I notice that it's too low in volume, I can just turn it up here and use that for gain staging, but it's mainly used to turn down the stereo width to 0 so that we have a mono bass sound. So I've opened up this first plugin in the chain, and this is BX Subfilter, which is a filtering plugin that allows you to add extra low end. It's kind of like that Waves plugin. I believe there's a Wave plugin that does this also, but what this allows you to do is it allows you to kind of set up a, I believe it's a special type of filter, which just adds a sub for the selected frequency here. I do tune this, so this is 49 Hertz, which is the same as G. So if I now play G, we get this nice bass tone. And you can play with the resonance. If you want an extra bit of sub, you can really get a nice amount or a nice low end out of it. But I tend to keep it on high or low, and you can also turn this up to get also more low end, as you can hear. You can really dial it up. So that's a trick you can use. This is a free plugin, I think. If I remember, I'll put a link in the description to where you can get it. If I haven't done that and you want to get it, either Google it or leave a comment telling me to do so, so I remember. So that's what this plugin does. There's a really cool, very specific plugin for one specific purpose, and in this case it works really well. Then we go into one of the main processes here, and what I'm doing here is I'm slightly compressing the click, so the transient of the bass sound. As you can see, we have no processing on the sub bass. If I play it again in G, you can see I have set this crossover point just below the second harmonic of the bass. It's not really visible for a long time, but you can see that we have our main sub area here, and then we have that second harmonic and the lower mid-range in the second one. So no processing here. On the second the lower mid-range, as you can see, I've set this to around 600 Hertz, but that kind of varies. As you can see, we are doing a very little bit of compression, just kind of getting the click down. You can see we kind of keep everything a little bit more squashed together, and then we turn up the volume actually by a lot here. I tend to, because we're using this sub filter, we tend to end up with a lot more sub than I want. So to combat that, I tend to just turn up all the higher frequencies a little bit more, and you will see that in other parts too. For example, here we're actually doing very little bit or very little compression, but we're actually turning it up by almost 3 dB here. And the settings aren't really important for this particular thing. Just note that what we're actually trying to achieve is a click sound that it's a little bit more squashed together, but a little bit louder, so that it fits better in the mix. Finally, the extreme high end, we are doing a lot, slightly more compression. We have a gain reduction of about 1.5 decibels here, as you can see, and we're turning it up a little bit more than we're reducing here, again to kind of bring out the click, while at the same time squashing its dynamics a little bit so that we get a nice transient. So that's what the dynamics are doing. And then to actually bring out the grittiness of the bass, I do this EQ here. This is a special EQ because it's dynamic. As you can see, we have this high end here, which is kind of following the dynamics of the actual bass sound. And again, with the same philosophy of bringing out the click a little bit more. As you can see at the exact start of the sounds, you can see that it kind of jumps up and adds a little bit more high end to our click than it does to the rest of our bass sound. And this EQ is just completely to taste. This is basically the basic setup, but I tend to play with it a lot during the track. Maybe if I want a bit of a darker bass sound, I can bring these down. I'll sometimes put them into the negative to get a really nice dark bass sound. But that's basically it for this EQ setting. Oh, if I zoom out, you can just keep in mind that it's very subtle. We're changing maximum 6 dB, but this is a little bit of an extreme setting. Normally, when I'm actually mixing this thing, I tend to just turn it down to like something like this, where it's just very subtle, just to kind of bring out our our mid-range just a little bit without you know, overwhelming it. And the whole philosophy behind this bass rack is that everything is very subtle, and it's not really doing anything except a very specific subtle effect. And because we're using a few of these subtle effects, you kind of get a unique sounding bass line there. So instead of going in and doing what I often see other people do, is they bring in an EQ and they just go ham on the frequencies, where they just bring up the mid-range like this, you know, like 12 decibels. And I don't tend to do that. I tend to be much more subtle and kind of spread the workload onto multiple plugins. And my philosophy, I think that way we kind of get a cleaner bass sound. Finally, we go into this limiter. Now this limiter is a little bit more for safety than for anything else. What I tend to do when I'm working on my bass sound at the mixing phase is sometimes I turn something up, and this is kind of there to check for me if I haven't turned anything up too much. I tend to have a hard time seeing with that on my particular system. So I have this limiter here at the end, and what this allows me to do is to quickly check if I'm reducing gain here on this limiter, which is this thing here. If I'm reducing gain there, oh, let me quickly close that. If we're reducing gain, then we can see that we're somewhere, we are adding a bit too much volume, but as you can see, as it goes standard, we're not actually losing any volume. Also, I tend to use this drive. It's set at a standard thing of 1.5 dB, somewhat around that. But I use this to kind of normalize the sound again. So I'll turn this up until we get a slight bit of gain reduction. And usually I have my actual track volume at around -9, so not too loud. But as you can see, now we have a slight bit of gain reduction, and we can just turn it down until we don't have that anymore. And now the signal is normalized, and we have a nice signal to work with there. So that's basically my standard bass patch. Now I want to go over some extra things you can do to make it unique. And that's gonna be a quick thing. The first thing I want to talk about is this stereo spread. I've shown this off on stream a few times. This is a plugin that allows you to add stereo to particularly to a bass sound without actually messing up the mono compatibility, which is really powerful. As you can see, I've dialed in some very low settings here. Normally it opens up with the spread at 50 and the widening set at 0, but I've turned both of them down like this. And I've also turned the mini frequency up to basically just not have any of nor the sub range, but also not the mid range in there, just kind of the clickiness. And if I play this now with it turned on, you can hear we get a slight bit of stereo there. Just the click kind of has a little bit more stereo, kind of makes it a little bit more interesting. So M Stereo Spread is one of the plugins I use a lot for my basses, just to give that little bit of stereo sound here. Finally, I want to go back into Patch and kind of show you how you can use different waveforms for your bass sound. I often tend to use just the normal standard saw wave with the trick where, which I talked about before, where you go in and edit individual harmonics. But lately I also been experimenting with different waveforms, and one thing you need to keep in mind is that you always want your waveform to kind of follow the saw harmonics, the saw harmonic thing. If you look at this, you can see this kind of curve here through the harmonics, and you kind of want your waveform to follow that, so you don't want any extreme harmonics going out. And one particularly funny waveform I found that actually works well is this icon has kick, which is often used in trap sounds and stuff like that, but it also works well for bass sounds. So I'm gonna just turn this down like right around here to kind of show you. And as you can see, this already has the phase set up. We want to set this to 0 because that's where the click is. That's where the start of the waveform is here. So now to kind of make it sound a bit better, if we turn this off, you can hear we kind of have we have a decent sound, but it could be better. We can go in here and again look at this thing, and as you can see, this is pretty much following the harmonics thing that we want. One thing I would do is I would turn the second one down a little bit, just so we are following it a bit more. But as you can see, this is pretty much a saw wave with the phases rearranged. So the phases of the individual harmonics are slightly rearranged that way. So that's the only difference here. But this works really well for a bass sound too. I also have a special waveform here, which I don't remember where I got this, but this is basically again the same thing, where we have a clickiness, and if we actually open this up, you can see it's slightly different content. In this context, you might want to turn up the second harmonic a little bit. So again, you're looking for this kind of curve, and then the phases doesn't really matter. What you can aim for is maybe like a clicky thing like we have here, as well as we had in the icon has kick. But if you saw the actual phase content of the icon has kick, one was much different than this one, and we still end up with the same clicky thing. So you can experiment with that a lot. And again, here it's important that you set your phase just before the click, and now this just has a little bit of a different sound. So experiment with the waveform, but keep in mind that you want to keep the saw harmonic series in there to get the right sound, in my opinion. And yeah, those are all the tricks I have for bass sounds. Keep it simple. I used to do a lot of layering and stuff like that, but I found that that just complicates things without making it sound better. And so yeah, keep it to one patch. If you want to add some stereo, just add one of these plugins to kind of bring out the stereo a little bit, but don't overdo it. So that's it. That's going to be the video for today. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, feel free to comment them down below so I can get to them. If you have any suggestions for future videos, the same, you can just comment them down below and I can cover them. I've actually had a few requests lately, and I'm going to be doing those in the upcoming days. Now with the coronavirus quarantine stuff, I tend to have a lot of free time, so I can really get to work on some different videos, and I'll be doing that. So if you enjoyed this, leave a like. If you want to see more, please subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Bye bye.